Hi everyone, it's Pablo again, and this is video 3 in our video series on weight loss. And this one video is titled, Where Did We Get the Idea That Dietary Fat, which is a fat that you eat in your food, was bad to eat and that breads, pasta, rice, and flour were good? So let's get going. Did you know that in 1977, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, chaired by George McGovern, published a diet to heart health hypothesis titled Dietary Goals in the United States. So this was the first time, you need to realize that this was the first time in our history that our government put out information that was telling us what to eat and what not to eat. And that's important because they've never in the past prior to this stepped in and told us this is what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. But for some reason they did it in 1977. And here's what they told us. They told us to stop eating saturated fats. If you're my age, you remember that clearly. Saturated fats was everywhere. How bad they were, how you needed to stop eating them, etc. They also, these recommendations were quickly spread by the medical establishment, which picked up these recommendations and started suggesting or recommending that this is what we do. And more importantly, I think, is that the mass media picked up on this, and there's documentation in the notes that show you how this whole evil circle between government, media, and medicine kind of all fell in together and started telling us what to stop eating and what we should eat instead. So in the video notes is a link to a summary of what our government, the food industry, and the media, and the medical establishment did for over 3 decades to create this problem. If I recall correctly, this is a link to a document or to a article that's at a university where this person went back and basically studied everything and figured out what happened. How did we get to a point where they were telling us not to eat this, eat that, and then media takes over and it spreads everywhere, and now 30, 40 years later, we are where we are now. Also in the video notes is a link to a fascinating study titled How the Ideology of Low Fat Conquered America by Anne LaBerge, published in the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. All these documents that I'm going to link to are really interesting if you really want to know how we got here. And also in the video notes is a link to the New York Times article titled How the Sugar Industry Shifted Blame to Fat, which discusses documents that were found that show that the sugar industry paid scientists, its names, and the scientists and doctors are named. They actually tell you who those doctors were. In the 1960s, these scientists were paid to write bogus medical studies that blamed dietary fat that we eat, such as saturated fats, to be the cause of heart disease rather than sugar, because the sugar industry knew that their product was bad for us. And so they wanted to shift the blame away, and they hired these doctors and scientists to produce a study that basically blamed dietary fat for it. Well, one of those doctors, here's the crazy part, one of those doctors later wrote papers that influenced the National Dietary Guidelines that I covered in the first bullet in that 1977 Select Committee, the Dietary Goals in the United States. Those diets that were or eating habits that were recommended by the government were based on this doctor's papers that he wrote. And this guy was paid by the sugar industry. It's all in those documents that I'm talking about here. It's broken down, and you can see that there's a direct link to the hysteria really that caught on in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s to say, oh, you can't eat fat, fat is horrible, it's fat for you, and direct links to the sugar industry paying scientists and doctors to say that in studies, so that then the government picked it up, and then it became the way to do things. And a lot of the problems we have today are tied directly, link by link, all the way back to these things that happened back then. So specifically, we were told these things, that due to saturated fat and cholesterol, and in order to prevent heart disease, we needed to stop eating red meat because it has saturated fat, eggs, lard and beef tallow. Lard, if you're not familiar with, or beef tallow because they haven't been used forever, is basically animal fat, and we use it to cook other foods. Butter, real butter, whole milk, cheese, and cream. All these things, if you think about it, have always been no-nos because of fat. So this is fat. All of these foods are high in fat, and so they told us to stop eating them. In fact, if you were in school in the 1990s or later, you probably remember the food pyramid, which told us to eat like this. We were told to eat mostly foods made from grains, which are down here at the bottom. If you look at it, the biggest piece is grains, which includes bread, cereals, rice, pasta. We were told to eat a moderate amount of vegetables over here on the left and some fruits. We were then told to cut back on and avoid protein, such as red meat, eggs, and bacon. If you think back, that's always been the case. We were also told to cut back on fats such as butter, lard, whole milk, and cheese, which is this section here, smaller amount. And at the very top, you see fats, oils, and sweets, which are even smaller section. So don't eat sweets, candy, or sugar. Sounds familiar. I'm sure this is exactly what you remember. So the food industry heard, now we're talking about the food industry. The food industry heard the government recommend that we not eat fat, all those things that we covered previously, meat and so forth. So they then came out with products labeled low fat, fat free. If you remember back again, and even to this day, it's still the case. A ton of things are out there are labeled low fat, fat free. And instead of lard or beef tallow, they offered vegetable shortening, vegetable oil bottles. Vegetable oils, and instead of butter they offered margarine. If you recall margarine back in the day, I'm sure it's still being sold. Instead of protein such as red meat or eggs, they offered products full of carbohydrates such as pasta, bread, and an unending list of products made with wheat, filler, or flour. And I'm going to talk about all of this later on as well. So in a nutshell, they told us to eat this way. A lot of this green stuff down here, which is bread, cereals, rice, pasta, and some medium amounts of vegetable and fruits, and then proteins and milks and so forth, all the way up with no-nos. So eat lots of bread, pasta, rice, cereals, eat some vegetables and fruits, eat very little meat, poultry, or seafood, or cheese, and do not eat eggs, butter, salt, or fats. So what's wrong with eating this way? In order to understand that, we're going to have to go to video 4. So we need to look at how we as humans have been eating for the last 2 million years. So in video 4, we're going to cover how evolution expects us to eat. So let's go on to video 4. If you like this series of videos and want to continue following it, please subscribe and click the little bell icon to be notified when I have a new video up. See you in video 4.